Have you ever been hung out to dry over ROI? I would guess at some point all of us have been, and today we hope to change that. Welcome to our complimentary webinar on Calculate the Impact of Customer Care Decisions. Today's presentation is sponsored by TMP Direct, delivering unique sales and customer care solutions for 25 years. I'm your host, Dan Collins, president of TMP Direct. When the economics of a business is challenged, the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, the CMO are all looking for value. What part of my business is delivering the greatest return? Numbers become a driving force. Putting money into the parts of a business that drive value and measurable return becomes attractive to the C-suite. Cutting back in other areas becomes inevitable. The customer care professional knows instinctively that a satisfied customer leads to a loyal customer, which leads to increased sales. The traditional thinking of an unsatisfied customer telling 10 to 12 friends is gone. Now they can tell hundreds or even thousands of people with a simple tweet. Social media has changed the landscape. We, the customer care leaders, must be able to define the business case that identifies the value and measures the return, the ROI for the C-suite. And that's the focus of today's topic. I would like to welcome our featured speaker, Scott Broetzmann, President and CEO of Customer Care Measurement and Consulting. Welcome, Scott. Scott is the author of an influential consumer rage study done in cooperation with Arizona State University and the Center for Services Leadership within the W.P. Carey School of Business. Scott has been helping customer care professionals build a business case around customer loyalty for over 20 years. As a result of today's presentation, you're going to go home with a proven formula for calculating what improvements in your organization will give you the best ROI, and in turn how to communicate that to the C-suite. Additionally, you also receive a white paper from Scott detailing the process as a follow-up, and then you will receive a brief survey asking for your feedback on today's presentation in preparation for the next presentation in our series. Just a couple housekeeping items. The presentation will take about 35 to 40 minutes. We will reserve the last 15 minutes or so for questions. You will see on your screen where you could submit questions. If there is a question you would like to ask during the presentation, please feel free to do so. Hopefully we will get to all your questions during our Q&A period. If not, we will include answers to all questions in the follow-up. It is now my pleasure to turn over the presentation to Scott Broetzmann.
Thanks, Dan. So it's going to be a pretty informative and data-rich hour. And with that in mind, let's jump right into talking about ROI. And one technical difficulty, my screen's not moving. So bear with us as we go through fixing that. There we go. Thank you. So the premise of our conversation today is one simple and profound truism, and that is that the C-suite, all the different roles of senior management, they covet, they're enamored with, they're smitten with, however you choose to view it, the intrinsic value of return on investment, or ROI. And said another way, our experience has been the customer care leaders who can produce and leverage an ROI calculation and use that to build a business case. That's probably the most essential part of the clause. Use it to build a business case. Those leaders are going to be considerably more likely to influence the C-suite than those who don't. In one respect, ROI would be the metaphorical Wonka's golden ticket, or the key to the C-suite magic kingdom, or the holy grail. And if it's possible, it's become more important today than it was yesterday. the tougher times, the leaner times that we live in, the ever-increasing internal competition for resources, whether it's for sales or marketing or training or HR, all those groups now are under the burden as well of producing ROI calculations. And then, of course, there's the ever-increasing customer care costs that have skyrocketed, especially for things like technology or to deal with some of the social media kinds of phenomenon that Dan was introducing when we started. So if it's possible, I think those kind of factors have only made the value of producing a customer care ROI even more important than they would have been yesterday or in prior years. But while it's certainly more important now, I would argue that this customer care ROI isn't a new concept. It's not a new challenge. You'll see here in front of you a quote that comes from a study that my colleague Mark Rayner did back in 1976. And that study is the infamous White House study, which was one that created a linkage between better service and profitability. And in that report is this really profound quotation, which I think highlights, two challenges that we'll talk about in a moment still exist today. The first of which is overcoming the conventional wisdom that customer care is a cost center only. That was certainly the case, as you see here, back in 1976. It was treated as an administrative or an overhead expense. And the second fascinating thing that this report and study called out was the claim that, at the time, there was a knowledge gap in the customer care community with respect to calculating an ROI, just the very basics of using and applying routine business acumen to the discipline of customer care. So we see that certainly was the case in 1976, and at one level it's sort of disappointing to look where we are some 35 years later. Because in 1976, customer care, as we noted, was really positioned as a administrative or overhead expense. And today, while it may not be called the same thing, there isn't a day that goes by in our life where we're not talking with customer care leaders whose main lexicon is organized around the cost per contact. What's the cost per contact? In 1976, customer care leaders were really trapped in a corner where they rationalized customer care expenses on the basis of preventing litigation or responding to consumer advocates like Ralph Nader. Well, today they don't have some of those same challenges. They're still there, but I think the bigger challenge is focusing on the right measures, and there are lots of distracting measures out there. Something I've called here myopic or wrong measures that really have nothing to do with ROI. First contact resolution, net promoter, call quality scores that you get from monitoring. Those are all vital measures for running a good call center. It's just that they're not an ROI calculation, and they're a poor substitute for having a dialogue in the C-suite about what have you done for me lately. There is no substitute for ROI. And then third, you see here, back in 1976, the claim was that there was a limited understanding of how to quantify the economic merits of customer care. Well, today, there isn't a limited understanding. I think most customer care professionals operate in a world where they're required to be business people every bit as much so as anybody in sales or marketing or finance. But at the same time, I don't think we've seen a lot of use of those tools. So today, really clinging to the assumption that the most productive dialogue in the C-suite is spoken in the language of ROI, we're going to try to accomplish three things. First, we're going to demonstrate proven tools for a real honest-to-goodness ROI calculation. And we're going to let our slide catch up here in a minute. There we go. So the first thing we're going to do is try and demonstrate proven tools for a real honest-to-goodness ROI calculation. Second, we're intentionally going to concentrate on what I call the conceptual or the strategic calculation. We'll digress for a moment to look at some of the mathematical equations. Those will be provided to you, by the way, in the white paper that Dan mentioned. But we'll sort of keep it at a level above that, not because we don't want to be transparent, but because we need another 2 hours to go through every single part of the calculation. And third, in so doing and focusing on that strategic and conceptual piece, we hope that ultimately this webinar culminates with your applying what you've seen today, using the white paper, and really conducting your own company-specific ROI calculation, which you should be able to do as a result of this and the white paper that you'll receive. So I'd offer 2 caveats before we jump into the formula. And that is, first of all, we're using mock data. So these are data drawn from a variety of sources, from lots of work we've done over the last 3 decades. But it is mock data in the sense that we're using it to illustrate some of the concepts and really exaggerate those so that the concepts are clear. But the second thing I note, that's fine for a webinar, but you really can't use benchmark data, normative data, industry-specific data when you do this on your own. You can't go to your senior management with somebody else's data or even benchmarking data. The kind of company-specific data that we'll talk about is maybe the hardest part of doing an ROI calculation, but without it, without company-specific data and a company-specific calculation, this ROI modeling won't work in the C-suite. It will be discredited as folly rather than taken seriously as part of a business case. So those are the 3 things that we hope to get done today. So let's begin with, I'm waiting for the slide to switch. There we go. Let's begin with our tool of choice for today, which is known as the profitability simulation model. And let me introduce this with a few considerations that you see referenced here in this slide. This profitability simulation model is a proven tool. It's been in the public domain since the middle 70s, coming out of that White House study that I referenced earlier. And it's been used in hundreds of applications. Every industry you can think of, it's been used by companies in North America, South America, the Middle East, Australia. It has wide application in a very diverse set of sectors. So it's proven as a seasoned tool from that perspective. The second thing I'd mention is that it's an honest-to-goodness, genuine ROI calculation. It has all the accoutrements that go with that kind of modeling. So, for instance, it has the output is expressed as a percentage, and it can be positive, it can be negative, it could be 0 if your contact center is break even as a result of the model. It generally produces an ROI for some kind of centralized customer care operation, whether that's a contact center or department or something of that nature. And finally, it's considerate not just of costs, which was one of the challenges we mentioned that customer care professionals have traditionally faced, but it, more importantly, balances out a view of those costs by estimating what the benefits are. So it's a honest-to-goodness, true ROI calculation. The third consideration I think we need to recognize before we look at some of the calculation material is that it's, as they say, simple but not easy. So it's a simple calculation. It only requires 2 steps, the first of which we'll come to know as the base case. That's calculating the ROI of our current, in this example, contact center. The second step, which is simple, is conducting a sensitivity analysis, and that's trying to pose and answer the question, if a change were made to the contact center, positive or negative, what's the impact on ROI? So it's simple from a perspective of a 2-step type of calculation, but it's not easy. Next slide, please. And it's not easy because while the math is simple, the gathering and negotiation of the source data required for this model is a challenge. There are 3 sources of data. Remember, I've said that if you use benchmarking data or normative data or data that is not credible for any reason, you're going to lose steam in terms of being able to work in the C-suite. Well, the 3 sources of data that you need are company-specific financial data, company-specific survey data, and then a third piece, which is negotiating those data and the results of the modeling with the CFO or the CFO's delegate, something like that. So we're going to talk about the first 2 sources of data now before we run through an example calculation, and we'll save our discussion about the negotiation with the CFO until we get to a point where at the end of the presentation it probably will be a little bit more meaningful. So the first source of company-specific data we need are financial data, and there are 7 specific elements of financial data, quote-unquote financial, that we need. And they range from, as you can see displayed here, starting with the average number of years a customer will buy from you, all else being equal. You can use this model to calculate out a ROI that's based on multiple years, lifetime value would be another word. Or you can also use the model, if you wanted to just calculate what the ROI would be based on 1 year of operating the contact center. And obviously, that's a situation and industry-specific decision, because the more years you use, either the greater your loss or your profit becomes, and the numbers can become real high. But in any event, if you're doing a multiple-year calculation, you would need the average number of years a customer would buy. The second piece of data you see that you need here is the average annual net profit per customer. That sounds simple, again, but it's not easy. What if you have multiple products? How does your corporation define net profit? What kinds of things are excluded in the calculation of profit? But obviously, without a profit figure per customer, it's very difficult to calculate the benefits associated with good service if you're providing that. Third, we need how many unique customers are contacting the center. Note that it's not how many contacts you have, but how many unique customers, because we calculate profitability and loss not on the basis of number of contacts, but on customers and what they buy and how much they buy. The fourth element is knowing what the cost of the center is. And here we're talking about the kitchen sink approach, the heat, the light, the rent, the people, the training, the goodwill remedies. All of those things become part and parcel of computing a loaded cost, if you will, for the center. The fifth and sixth elements have to do with what might otherwise be called the costs or cost avoidance associated with third-party dispute resolution. Some industries are greatly affected by litigation, by third-party dispute resolution, arbitration, those kinds of things. And we're incorporating assumptions into the model to deal with what does it cost when complaints get escalated to those channels, but also what kinds of costs can we avoid if we're able to do a better job in terms of satisfying customers and prevent that sort of escalation. The final element in the financial data is only used if you're doing a multi-year ROI calculation, and it has to do with the cost of capital, sometimes often equated with what it costs your company to borrow money, and sometimes also called the net present value. And here it's the concept that if you're doing a multi-year calculation, you have to incorporate an assumption of a net present value, meaning the dollars you receive in the future aren't worth as much as the dollars you receive today. And any ROI calculation is sensitive to that kind of reality and incorporates and puts that otherwise sometimes known also as a discount rate, into the calculation so that whatever dollars you're saying you're earning as a result of the center, again, are corrected for that reality of the net present value. So those are the financial pieces of data that we need. And I think you get a sense as you look at the range of those data and the type of data that it may be a little bit more challenging than meets the eye to gather. The second source of data we need is data from what we call a baseline survey or company-specific survey data. And I'll have more to say about the baseline survey in a minute as a portal for gathering this sort of data. But what this data does is it tells us how satisfied customers are that contact our center, the resulting loyalty of those customers who contact our center, and the word-of-mouth behavior that's associated with the kind of service they experience when they contact the center. And you can see here that percentage of contactors satisfied, mollified, meaning they're not completely satisfied, they're not dissatisfied, and those that are dissatisfied. Then some measure of loyalty. It varies by industry. It could be would you buy again, which is the repurchase measure, or it could be recommend if it's not in a sector where the repurchase measure is as meaningful. And then finally you'll see a variety of word-of-mouth data that's also gathered as part of this survey exercise, where we want to know how many other people were told about the experience that customers had when they contacted our company for service. And each of those are very different numbers, positive or negative. The last element you see here is how satisfied are contactors with their experience across the contact experience, access, personnel, response, a variety of those kinds of things. And while that data is not necessary to compute an ROI, you'll see when we come to the sensitivity analysis that without that data, you're left in a position to guess what are the key drivers that most influence whether people will be satisfied with their contact center experience. That data becomes very useful when repurposed to help us understand what should we do differently. Not all things in a contact center in terms of the experience are created equally. If you're doing the right kind of survey, it should also help you understand what those are. So this baseline survey, typically done at a minimum every 3 years. It typically would involve getting completed surveys via the web or whatever other methodology is being used from 500 to 1,000 customers that recently contacted your center. If you have a very small contact center population, you do a census. If you have a very large contact center population, you can do a sample. But that 500 to 1,000 completed interviews is really predicated on the complexity of your contact center operation. If you're running a multi-channel center where people contact by telephone and by email and by chat, you need more interviews because you probably are going to compute an ROI for each of those different channels. If you have a very small single channel center, you're only handling primarily phone calls, that can be a smaller number. Or if you have multiple segments of customers, business versus a consumer, and you have different call centers for those, maybe you're going to need more interviews. So a variety of things influence that. I guess the only thing I'd say is that, again, credible data as an input is required to have credible, trustworthy output in terms of the ROI calculation. You don't want to get in front of your C-suite and have a survey based on 10 people that you're using to extrapolate and produce an ROI. So when we couple our financial data with the survey data, we're then in a position to begin the step one exercise of the calculation. And recall that the step one base case calculation is estimating the current state ROI, the ROI right now, the ROI as your center is, or as your department is, and our output from that ultimately will be, as you see at the very bottom of the slide here, an estimated ROI expressed as a percentage that's positive, negative, or if you're break even, it'll be 0. Now there are two component formulas that are used with these various data to produce that base case ROI. The first at the top of the slide is understanding how much net profit the contact center earned, either in a year or in multi-years, depending on what you're doing. And that particular result is obtained by looking at the profits the center made, both from customers who have contacted it. In this case, 578,000 are attributable to customers contacting the center, as well as the profits that you would gain or lose from the word of mouth that those customers share with their friends, neighbors, and relatives, sort of an opportunity cost or gain, if you will. And then in this example, it's roughly $589,000. Now, if you went to your CFO and you said, we earned last year, as a result of our great service, $589,000 that without us you wouldn't have earned, the CFO would probably laugh at you, because the CFO would say, well, before we had a contact center, we still managed to make profits and still had customers, and we still managed to handle their questions and problems. So this second component in this top equation is subtracting out the profits we would have earned anyway, even if there was no center available. And that data comes from the survey data, where we know certain customers who had a question or problem and didn't contact us are still going to buy from us. So there is a piece of empirical data behind that. If we had another 15 minutes, I could explain how and where it comes from. But safe to say, at this point, the net profit is a conservative figure that references what we're earning, but it takes into consideration the fact that without the center, we still would have probably earned some profits despite not having that channel available. Once we have the gain or loss or net profit, we then, in the bottom of the slide, you can see, do the second component calculation, which is to produce the ROI. And that's simply taking the profits or loss and dividing it by the annual cost of the center. And when we do that, in this example, you can see we get a positive 6% ROI. And I've seen ROIs, by the way, that range from a negative 500% up to a positive 500%. Again, it's very industry specific, and the better your data input, the more credible and trustworthy your data output will be in terms of the calculation. Now, I promised you we wouldn't get into the weeds, but I'm going to digress for 2 slides, because I think these 2 slides help, I think, further an understanding of what this model is about and how it works. And the first of those 2 slides that we'll digress to is a very simple analysis. These data come from our National Customer Rate Study that Dan was mentioning. They're based on 4,000 completed interviews in the United States over since 2003, so a lot of data. And the basic premise that you see illustrated here is that customers who are satisfied with the action taken by a company that they contact for assistance with a question or problem, those customers that are satisfied are significantly more brand loyal, measured by their recommend intention here, than are those customers who are less than satisfied. Customers who are satisfied are roughly 4 times more loyal than those who are sort of in between, and roughly 15 times more loyal than those customers who are dissatisfied. And those customers who are dissatisfied tell a lot of people negative word of mouth, versus those customers who are satisfied who tell, albeit fewer, but generally are telling them more positive things. So the underpinning of this profitability simulation model is really based on this set of logical assumption and data that to the degree that you satisfy more customers, you're going to earn more money through their brand loyalty and their positive word of mouth. To the degree that you dissatisfy a lot of customers, or they're less than satisfied, is the degree to which the service that you're providing will decrease brand loyalty and decrease sales through the negative word of mouth generated in the marketplace. So that's sort of, again, still at a strategic level, but it's an important building block for how the model operates. But you may be asking, nonetheless, well, show me the math. Well, in the base case calculation, the first part where we're not looking at the word of mouth, here's a very simple example. And again, the math is simple. If you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, you can use this model. And here, in this fictitious example, the call center or contact center in question handles contacts from roughly 250,000 unique customers. It did a survey and it found out that 40% of those are satisfied, 20% are in between, and 40% are dissatisfied. And for those customers who are satisfied, 9 out of 10 will buy again. For those who are mollified, only about 2/3 will buy again, and for those who are dissatisfied, only about 1/3 will buy. So to figure out how many customers the contact center is saving, all we have to do is do the simple math. 250,000 by the 40% satisfied, by the 9 out of 10 that will buy again, means that among customers that we're satisfying, we've saved 90,000 of those customers. Among those who are less than satisfied, they're mollified, 32,500. And among dissatisfied customers, believe it or not, some of them still buy from you. Maybe it was one bad transaction they had that they were dissatisfied. Maybe the costs of switching are too high. Maybe they can't, depending on which industry you're in. They're bound by a contract and such. So when you look at, again, it's a simple linear model where in this example, the contact center is earning profits from 152,500 customers, which when we multiply by the average profit per customer of $2,400 roughly, this center is earning $370 million. Now, of course, we'd have to subtract out of that profits it wouldn't earn otherwise, but safe to say, all we want to do here is sort of give you an example of the math that you'll see in the white paper that you'll receive, and give you some sense as to how the calculation proceeds in the base case. And the remaining calculations are much the same as you'll see here. So let's assume that you've done the base case calculation and you've produced your ROI, and in the example we've been looking at, the base case ROI was positive 6%. But if you're like any contact center director, manager, leader, the contact center is a dynamic place. Things change. You're asked to make changes. You're asked to improve. You're asked to absorb things that maybe you don't like headcount reductions or other kinds of cuts. And so the model wouldn't be very useful if we weren't able to use it to pose what-if scenarios and then understand their ROI implications. And in this example, you can see that this contact center is considering the ROI implications of 7 different real-world kinds of things: new technology, or training, or marketing and advertising, or offshore outsourcing, etc. And among these examples, 3 are determined to have a positive impact, and 4 have a negative impact. So the sensitivity analysis is a means of constructing a real-world business case that's responsive to all of the kinds of things that as a call center leader you're asked to consider, but without this model, you're merely assuming or guessing what the relative impact is, and you're stuck, usually without the model, talking about it solely in terms of costs. So how do we use the sensitivity analysis? Well, it's really a 3-step kind of sequence to begin to use a sensitivity analysis. You have to first identify the priorities. That is, and we're assuming here that it's focused on the positive, something you want to change and improve. Second, you have to operationalize that priority. And then third, you have to modify the assumptions in the profitability simulation model. You're simply going to rerun the model with some new assumptions that we'll make clear in a moment. So to make it concrete, in this example, this particular center has identified its priority as providing better responses to customers. It's going to focus on giving them what they want, not in terms of money, but the softer things like apologies and thanks and those kinds of remedies. If we're going to operationalize that, you can't improve the response, at least in this example, without offering skills training to your front line. And in this case, it's going to be skills training focused on improving their probing and active listening skills. We then modify the assumptions in the model, and there are really a couple of different levers to be pulled in modifying those assumptions. One is you ask and answer, does it change the number of customers that are contacting the center? Well, in this case, no. Providing training to provide better responses isn't going to change how many customers contact our center. The second question and lever that you ask and pull is, will the initiative increase the satisfaction level of people contacting the center? And in this case, probably fair to assume that it will. And this particular contact center has assumed 10% increase in satisfaction associated with that change. And then finally, the third lever to pull is to understand what it will cost. And in this case, the training costs $50,000. And in some cases, those initiatives will decrease costs. Headcount reduction is the most obvious example. But in this case, of course, providing training doesn't reduce the cost of running the center. So sensitivity analysis for building a business case requires set priorities, operationalize those, and then come up with a new set of assumptions about a change in satisfaction level and the associated cost for the most part. Some of these initiatives, if you did a big advertising campaign, would affect things like how many customers are contacting the company. But you might then also ask, and if you didn't, I would encourage you to ask, well, how do we identify the priorities? Remember that earlier we talked about a baseline survey to gather the data, the company-specific data to support the ROI modeling. And I mentioned that if you're going to go to the trouble of doing that, maybe it would be a good idea to understand the key drivers of satisfaction with the contact center experience. And you don't have to do that. You could anecdotally guess what are the key drivers, or what should you do differently in order to improve the experience. Kind of risky, but you certainly could do that. You could use call monitoring data or your experience to do that. I think the better way, of course, is to have empirical data, feedback from customers to drive that priority setting process. On the left-hand side of this chart, you can see 27 different measures that typically might be used in any kind of satisfaction survey about a contact center. And they'll vary a little bit depending on whether you're asking about email or telephone, but by and large, they're in the ballpark. And these kinds of questions asked on a 5-point scale from very satisfied to very dissatisfied can be used to do an analysis of what are the key drivers of satisfaction and or loyalty associated with my customer base and my contact center. Now, there's a statistical model called multiple regression, which can be used to do this analysis. Here we're just showing you the simplified output. And we're trying to answer the question, if I improve 5%, the percentage of people who contact me that are very satisfied in any of these 27 different measures, what will the corresponding change be in either their overall satisfaction or their repurchase intention or their recommend intention, whatever measure you're using, and what is the percentage point change in that, what I'm calling metric of consequence. And you can see here in the example that not all things are created equal. These are the groupings for the 27 metrics you see on the left: response, the rep, getting extra help, fairness, and access, ease of getting through. And in this example, obviously, the priority would be response, because if I looked at a 5% improvement in all 27, I gain 11.2 points of overall satisfaction or recommend intention or what have you. But most of those points are attributable to response. What's the least effective for the lowest ROI for things like access. Now again, this is mock data. You have to have your own data for your own customers to validate what those key drivers are. Now that's at the strategic level. If we take it down one level of granularity, here are the 27 attributes, same we saw on the prior page. And on the far right column, what's the change in the metric of consequence, overall satisfaction or recommend intention or repurchase intention. And what you see is that some of these improvements or improvements to some of these measures is very robust. So if you improve the responsiveness of the representative, you gain a lot. 1.3 points for your metric of consequence. Or if you, in number 12, allow them to talk to a product specialist, you gain a point. But other measures have absolutely no impact. You can improve 5% the representative's tone, making them sound not overly friendly or like a robot, and what you get back is nothing, 0% change. Or number 16, ensuring that they only have to tell their story one time, only gains you 1/10 of a percentage point. So the point of this type of analysis is that in the absence of good empirical data about what the key drivers are and what influences your customers' satisfaction and loyalty, you're left guessing what your priorities should be. And better, one should have some kind of data to run the sensitivity analysis, something like this, in whatever way, shape, or form, based on customer feedback that helps you overturn conventional wisdom about what things are important and what things aren't. So pulling this all together, if you've conducted the base case calculation, which you see here in the first column, and you've done some sensitivity analysis, and here the particular example, the contact center is considering either more training of some sort, advertising to improve awareness about the center, or a headcount reduction, you're in a position, using the model after you've done your changes to assumptions through the sensitivity analysis, to estimate the ROI associated with each of these different initiatives. So the base case was 6, but for each of these different initiatives, you can see there's a positive ROI for training, but negative ROIs for these other 2 initiatives. And the most negative initiative in this case is a headcount reduction. So when you look at this sort of presentation of data, you're in a position with the C-suite to really present them with a genuine business case that is constructed by looking at relative differences in ROI. You can engage your C-suite in a rational and fact-based dialogue about about how the contact center is run and what should be done differently, rather than just fighting battles based on the volume of contacts and the number of complaints. This kind of model puts you on different footing in your C-suite, a footing that your peers will be envious of if you go to the trouble of collecting credible data, both financially and through that survey. Which brings us to the third source of data that I promised I'd save to the end, and that was the negotiation with the CFO or her or his delegate. And that negotiation really is the linchpin of this modeling. You have to have the CFOs or their delegates buy-in, not just to the company's specific financial data, but more importantly to the output. When this model has been used to its greatest success is when companies have worked to expose the CFO to that data and really establish a dialectic. And what's a dialectic? Well, it's the art or practice of getting to the truth by engaging in logical arguments. Well, in this case, what it means is you're going to let the CFO look at the output and throw stones at it and say why it doesn't work, or question the assumptions. And then you're going to go back and iterate through to a model that everybody agrees on before anybody else looks at it, before you share it with others in the organization. So this is really the most important step if you're going to get it right and gain support for your output. So what we've tried to do today is provide you with a footprint for having a meaningful dialogue in the C-suite that where meaningful means you're able to create a business case for change. And we've made 4 basic arguments that ROI is powerful in the C-suite. I don't think anyone would debate that. There isn't any C-suite that wouldn't like to talk about ROI. Secondly, we've tried to argue that notional ROI calculations or notional metrics, maybe that's a better way to put it, like first contact resolution, frequency of contacts, call quality data, mystery shopping data, all of those might be good, feel-good data, but ultimately they're going to spell out your demise in the C-suite because they're not ROI calculations. And in some respects, they can do you more of a disservice if you're focusing on metrics that are solely related to cost. Third, we've tried to argue that even if you have the calculation, just understanding your current ROI probably isn't going to get you very far. You need to conduct a sensitivity analysis to say what's the relative change in ROI given some set of changes in conditions. And then finally, we've suggested that after you've done all of that, you have to negotiate the output of that with someone in the C-suite, preferably the CFO. We've come to the conclusion of what I call the presentation part, and we'd like to invite questions from the audience.
Scott, thank you very much. That was an insightful and informative and detailed presentation. I think you've given a lot of information that our audience hopefully can get their hands around, something that's tangible. We do have a couple questions that came in. Let's get to them. You lay out a very comprehensive plan for the project. A question came in. How much, I know it's not going to be perfect, but rule of thumb, how much time is required to complete this type of project?
The short answer would be somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And it's on the shorter end if you have a very simple contact center and if you have a lot of data and you have unobstructed access to your CFO to do the kind of negotiation of data that we talked about. It's on the longer side if all those are the opposite. You don't have a lot of data, you're in a big organization, it's hard to get in touch with and schedule time with CFOs. But usually with good due diligence and with the right data, it shouldn't take more than a couple of months, 3 months, something like that.
You spoke a lot about very tangible pieces of data that you want to survey, collect that data. It's quantitative, and make it part of this formula. A large part of the traditional customer service communication process is word of mouth. And the question is, how do you quantify a dollar amount of profit or loss due to the word of mouth concept?
Well, the same way you do for the customers that are contacting you. So, a customer who would buy from you based on what he or she heard is worth the same as a customer that will buy from you based on their experience. So that doesn't really change. But word of mouth is a wild card in this modeling because if you're providing really good service, you're earning money through positive word of mouth. if you're providing mediocre or lousy service, it's exponentially more of a loss because people tell twice as many others at a minimum about their bad experience as happy customers tell about their good experience. Now, the other wild card in that regard is social media, and to incorporate social media assumptions into the model is more a matter of having the right kind of survey data available to you about how many of your customers are using social media, what are the average number of people that are reading or hearing about their experience through that social media channel. So you can do the ROI modeling by channel if you wanted to, or you can simply add those components into the word-of-mouth assumptions that we were looking at in the model. But I'll just digress for 5 seconds and say the 2011 National Customer Rate Study, which is scheduled to be released in October or November, we had a whole bunch of social media questions, and we know that social media, despite the fact that a lot of people use it, we're going to see in that data that it doesn't have quite the impact on buying intentions as conventional wisdom would suggest. And I say that having nothing to do with the modeling, but more in response to what we see in the marketplace where companies are diverting, unreasonable amounts of resources to social media that probably would be better spent on the traditional side of the house, because that's where many more customers are being influenced by than they are through social media.
You're bucking the trend there, Scott. I guess what you're seeing in the rate study may contradict some of the school of thought today about how companies are treating social media, how consumers are interacting on the social media forum and environment.
It's not that social media is unimportant. That's not the point that we're raising. It's not that it doesn't deserve some resources. That's not the point. It's that senior management typically is overreacting to what I would call the negative social media examples that have come up. The United guy that had his guitar broken and put it on YouTube, or the Domino's pizza guy who picked his nose and put it in the pizza. All those things have catastrophic brand impact. But for most companies, that isn't what social media is going to be about. And there are plenty of reasons to say that maybe the other channels which generate a lot of volume and a lot of impact should receive more resources. So.
Well, and that was good, because that was a good follow-up. There was a question that followed up the word of mouth with the general relationship and context of where social media fits today. And one other question, it's actually kind of a multi-part question. I'm going to put a couple together. There were some questions about best practices, again, around the gathering the company-specific survey data. Do you stay with the 500 to 100 surveys? Is that a good number? Does it need to be a percentage of your annualized contacts? That's first part. The second part, what methodology do you recommend that's best to collect the data? From a selection standpoint, is it best to use a randomized selection process? And for what time period do you want to look at the selection? 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, etc.
Yeah. And my comment when we went through that section was, at a minimum, you're probably refreshing the data you use, the survey data, every 3 years. And that may be in some industries too long, and in other industries you may be able to get by even longer. I don't want to get up in front of my boss if I'm in a company and present an ROI calculation and get the question, where did you get the survey data? And you say, well, we collected it 7 years ago. That's not a position I want to be in. You probably don't either. I also don't want them to say, well, how many customers did you interview? And I say, well, we got surveys back from 50 people or 60 people. That doesn't put me on firm footing either. So at the same time, you want to reduce what you're spending and reduce the resource investment to do the survey. So I think while it's situation specific, 500 to 1,000 interviews gives you data that statistically is precise at a very very reasonable level that any market researcher, any CFO, any marketing person would look at and say, that's pretty good, credible data. And that's not driven by how many contacts or customers you have. That's just the reality of statistical tables having to do with margin of error and precision.
Okay. And
best methodology. Whenever possible, web-based. That may not be possible in some industries if you don't have email addresses in order to push those out. But the worst methodology for this is telephone.
And it's the random selection when you do the selecting of the database.
Generally random, but sometimes you'll stratify that randomness based on, I want to have so many people that contacted us by email, so many by phone, so many by live chat, or so many of these customers, so many of these other types of customers. But yes, within that stratification, it's a random selection.
Well, it looks like there's another level of detail that if anyone is interested in getting into that level of how you structure one of these surveys to establish the ROI argument, Scott is available for contact, and I'm sure he will provide his insight and his feedback. We are coming to the end of our hour, so I do want to thank the audience for their participation and thank Scott for a very thorough and insightful presentation. Just a reminder, all of our guests today will be receiving Scott's white paper detailing this process. We will get that out today. And if any of you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Our contact information will be included in the follow-up. Again, thank you for joining us, and never get hung out to dry over ROI again. Have a good day.